Greetings, Mr. Jason. You are a friend of our UATV channel and a political expert with great expertise. And for today's interview, I would like to inquire, what the hell is going on in the world right now with the United States, the new world, really, that we all wake up today?
Well, it is certainly a very new world from what it was just a little while ago. At the same time, I think that there's a lot going on. It's very hard to digest all of it at once because there's a lot of moving pieces. Obviously, what's gone on with Trump and the White House, with Zelensky, the news. But there's been a lot of things that happened since then. We've seen that Europe's become much more united about supporting Ukraine. We've seen that the British are taking a much stronger role than what they had historically, though they've done a great job this entire war, of course. And what's coming ahead? Macron is following through with what he promised, which is that France would play a central role in trying to assist Ukraine. So that there's a lot going on is obviously the case. A lot of things that are moving very quickly, and we still don't know what the outcome will be. But there is a lot of reasons that we should still maintain hope.
Mhm. Well, you are an expert in Eastern Europe. You've had your own PhD defended here in Eastern Europe, but you are an American expert. And as an American, what do you think about the internal processes, political processes that are happening right now with the new administration rewriting all rules in the country, basically, and we are seeing the reflection of this in the foreign policy of the United States?
So I think it's important to note that all of foreign policy depends on domestic politics, always. So when you see a president say something, he's going to say what he says, usually because his target constituency, that is his voters, want to hear that. It's less about what the international community thinks, though the international community analyzes whatever leaders say, but that's never the target. For instance, when we had the situation in the Oval Office a few days ago with Zelensky, it's very clear that Donald Trump was repeating phrases and giving ideas that he knew his voters would like to hear. They were typical things for Donald Trump to say. J.D. Vance jumped in and said things that aligned very strongly with what MAGA voters might like to hear. And Zelensky said what Ukrainians expected him to say as the president of their country, which is he represented the needs of Ukraine. So everyone plays to a role that they have. They play to the constituency that they have. So that's the first thing is whenever we look at foreign policy, we have to look at the domestic demands because that is what's going to drive the foreign policy of a country. And ultimately, I think if we look at countries and we discuss them in the abstract, it usually misses that. We talk about the role of Germany or Britain, but why do they have that role? Well, it's because their domestic audience wants that. Their voters want that. And so they'll do what their voters want them to do.
Yes, and how do you view the possible future outcome of this basically show what happened in the Oval Office? The Ukraine support from the United States will be cut off completely. Maybe even the Biden's defense support that was granted before will be cut in this administration after this pretext that happened in the Oval Office.
Well, that's definitely possible. And on Monday, today, they will decide that. So it looks like in the near term, we're going to find out. So is it possible? Most certainly. I think it's quite possible, unfortunately. But at the same time, as I said, I think there's a lot of reasons to maintain some optimism. We see that the Europeans are much more united than they were before. They've also awoken to this new reality. And I think in the long term, frankly, I know this is going to be very controversial. I think the office incident didn't work out in Ukraine's interest. So I know many people wouldn't probably make that argument, but I think it actually will.
Yes, and some people tend to say a slow death is far, far worse than the chaos that is happening right now with Europe literally waking up in the cold shower. And I'm really encouraged by seeing Keir Starmer's press conference and how confident and how calm and intellectual he sounds after the London summit of European leaders. We see Emmanuel Macron working with that. And if they can sustain the defense support for Ukraine right now, the role of the United States for 3 years, maybe we still have a chance to hold on for another year. And I don't know if you have seen the interview of Kirill Budanov, the latest one. He said that in 2026, if Russia continues the war, the expenditures for this war, some very, very bad processes in their economics will start to happen, and they literally cannot be turned back. What do you think about that?
Well, that's absolutely the case. I mean, I think that's actually one factor here that we rarely talk about. So there's three different reasons that a war will end, right? So we usually focus on the military defeat and taking cities, and that's what's covered the most in the press. But there's two other factors which we talk about a lot less that actually I think are even more important. So one is the society itself. So societies have their own problems. They can have collapse. They can have diseases outbreak. There can be a lot of things that happen within a country that forces it to stop fighting. But there's another thing that can happen, which is the economy collapses. So a country that can no longer economically afford a war, usually will end up losing the war. And actually, if you look historically, the amount of expenditures a country has for war is a high indication of if they're going to win the war or not. Not always, but there's a pretty good correlation. So in the case of Russia, what do we see going on? Well, we said that they have an inflation rate that's about 27, 28%, could be actually more. In addition to that, we said that there's a massive lack of labor. And the lack of labor is sort of interesting because the unemployment rate in Russia is historically at its lowest it's ever been. But as you know, when there's extremely low unemployment, it's actually an indication of high inflation. It doesn't mean that things are going just great. And we see that at this point is creating a lot of different problems. We see there's already shortages of products, very basic foodstuffs such as butter. But we see further that within Russia itself, they're having a massive demographic crisis, and the population is becoming very concerned by that. There's no way that they could keep up with the expenditures that they currently have for the hospitals and schools, but they're spending more and more on the military. It's about now 30% of their budget goes to defense, which is actually just the war in Ukraine. But there's something very important about that. The Russian government, to be able to finance this war, has been taking out money from private banks, huge amounts of money. And at this point, many of the banks are on the verge of going bust. And the reason is simple. Those banks have been subsidizing mortgages for years. Huge subsidizations from the government for people to take out mortgages. So people were taking out mortgages for houses, for apartments, and then a majority of them took out secondary loans to refurnish them, to fix them up, hoping they would rent them out. Because there was a period of time that the real estate prices in Russia just kept going higher and higher and higher. But now real estate prices are starting to collapse. So people are going totally underwater with those houses and those apartments, and they can't afford to pay them back. So as the banks are increasingly in a pinch, as people are not going to pay back those loans, well, they're also in a pinch because the government has taken out huge amounts of money. So the government's only option is to print more money to pay back those loans, the ones that the government had taken out. The mortgages themselves, which are subsidized by the government, is creating inflation. But if the government has to step in to balance those banks' balance sheets to make sure that they don't go bust, that creates even more inflation. So Russia is really an economic situation that's quite precarious. And any day, it really could go bust. Normally in a country like we've seen in Russia, what we've seen in Russia is not normal for a country where we'll see the ruble devaluate or gain value at, say, 15% in one day and then go back down a couple of days later. That's not normal to bounce up and down like that. There's significant economic problems within Russia that are structural in nature. And sooner or later, they're going to come home to roost.
Yes, I can see all the problems that you underlined in different publications of economic publishers and everything else. I may note that Ukraine has actually similar problems with inflation, with the lack of labor because obviously of mobilization and they need to defend our country. But there's a huge difference. Ukraine is on the defense in this battle and Russia is on the offense. They can end the war any day. They can end it today by saying, okay, we're going out of this, no more money for the war, no more war, and the war starts at this point. And Ukraine simply cannot stop because, if Ukrainians stop shooting, then Ukraine stops existing. Then the Russians will actually try to occupy the entire territory. And that's a huge difference, but in most cases with the economy, there are some similarities, maybe, yes?
Well, there's actually, I think, a very big difference that's even more important than the fact that Ukraine's defending itself, which is that Russia is having to print money and take out loans to pay for this military. I mean, this has been a huge expenditure. It's forced them to close down a lot of public services to afford more military. But more important than that is that they are actually having to pay for it. In the case of Ukraine, a lot of the money that's going through and a lot of the weapons is not being paid for by Ukraine. It's by foreign support. So when we're looking at the economic data that's coming out of Russia or coming out of Ukraine, that's public because much of what Russia publishes is no longer, or used to publish, is no longer being published because the situation is so bad. But when you look at the data, we're not looking at the same sort of situation. Ukraine is being heavily subsidized. So it's not facing the exact same pressures that Russia is.
Mhm.
Russia's pressures are very real. Look, I mean, since Trump has taken office, both China as well as India have said that they're going to stop buying Russian oil if it violates US sanctions because they're scared of the risk of American sanctions. Quite rationally, as both countries do far more trade with the US than they do with Russia. So looking ahead, what does that mean? Well, if oil prices continue to decrease, which is estimated to do, Russia's going to be in a tougher and tougher situation. And I think in the long term, it's not a situation that's going to be able to survive.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. J. You've inserted some hope, I believe, in our viewers too, as well as me. Maybe some final remarks on our today's interview about your insights, your prognosis on the situation, or maybe just a couple of words to reinforce your belief.
So I think that when we're looking at the situation, I know a lot of people are alarmed by what's going on with the United States. I am as well, of course. At the same time, I'm not panicked and I'm not afraid of it. Because if we look at what this really does mean, it means a few things. It means that Europe today is in a different position than it was before. The US had always played the dominant role in security in the NATO structure. But at this point, it's very clear that the Europeans understand they have to provide for their own security. And the Europeans, much more than the Americans, appreciate the fact that their security depends on Ukraine's security. So I think at this point, they have a much better consensus and much more clear consensus that fine, if the Americans won't be involved, then we'll have to take matters into our own hands. Remember, it was during the Biden administration that it was forbidden by Ukraine, Biden administration forbid Ukraine from being able to use long-range weapons that were coming from the U.S. as well as coming from our European allies. Imagine that. Whereas European allies who said we allow the Ukrainians to use these to attack within Russia, and the Americans said no, you cannot, because we helped produce those weapons, or we produced all those weapons, and so you cannot do that. At this point, though, even though at this point, though, the Europeans understand it doesn't matter what the Americans think. They have to protect their own security. And I don't think that the White House can put restrictions on them. They'll allow them to do what they need to do in order to better secure their own future and secure Europe's future. And the best way to secure Europe's future is to secure Ukraine's future.
Yes, and there's an idea of the common European army. And imagine if Ukraine's military will be part of that joint European force of the defense. That will be a force to recognize on the continent indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Smart.
Most certainly.
Yes, it was Jason J. Smart on UATV and this very good comment for our today's episode. Thank you very much and take care.